Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We're having some technical difficulties there. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to the fifth session in our Operator Certification webinar series, NPDES Permit Regulations and Discharge Limitations. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box at any time throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab from your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for the session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via mail within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories throughout our building, technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, James Markham. He's a research engineer at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. All right, James, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. And we've also got AJ Barney along with us, who's also a research engineer here to help with the Q&A. We're here again to talk about operator certification. Wastewater operator certification is, of course, required because legally you can't operate most wastewater treatment facilities without a license. That license has some requirements, typically based on facility size and the size of the population you're being served. And of course, there are experience and education requirements, which vary depending on which level of license you're testing for and the jurisdiction you're in. And of course, you have to pass the certification exam. And that's what this series is here for. It's designed to help you pass that exam. I highly recommend, and brought this up before, that you check with your state licensing agency's website for available study guides and other useful materials, particularly when it comes to today's topic, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES for short. It's typically a much smaller part of the exam. There aren't usually a lot of questions about it, but it is a somewhat complicated topic, as you'll see in our talk today. And the specifics of the program vary a little bit from state to state. And although today's topic might be one that's more likely touched on in your certification exam in your particular jurisdiction, at a minimum, you really should know what the NPDES system is, some basic history, terms, applications, and some of its basic requirements. We, of course, can't show every state's certifying agency's website in the time we have, and some are more helpful than others, but this is an example from Oklahoma. It's the first thing that comes up if you Google search Oklahoma Wastewater Operator Certification. And as you can see where that big blue arrow is, there's actually a system manual and study guide for the state of Oklahoma certification. So if you happen to be in Oklahoma, this guide is going to be really good for you to look at. There are many other tools available as well, but for this one, this is what it looks like on the outside, and the regulations section is laid out in an entire chapter. So you can see here, monitoring, sampling, reporting requirements are covered in Chapter 3 in Oklahoma. They're usually in a similar area in other states. Something about general regulations and management might be in a slightly different location, but this is typically where information about state and federal permitting would be listed. And so it's a really great resource. This happens to be Texas's. They don't have a guide sitting there, but one of the things that they do have is a need to know list. And most states have something like this, which basically lay out the topics that you need to understand for various levels of certification. And one of the things that you need to know in Texas is the basic laws and rules that grant authority to the TCEQ to protect waters of the state by issuing waste discharge permits and licensing operators. So state websites are a great source of information. Again, a big plug for studying and going to those sites to get available information. Most, if not all, states have laws and regulation relating to the protection of their waters, both surface and groundwater. And you might have specific regulations and laws governing groundwater discharges from a lagoon system like you see here. This one happens to be in New Mexico. But although every state typically has laws to protect their waters, the permitting program we're talking about today, the NPDES, has its authority and origins in federal law. So federal law and regulations related to the discharge into our nation's waterways from specific points, like what happens to be shown here, which is the outflow of a treatment plant that we worked with a couple of years ago down in Texas. They have exceptionally clean effluent and fish in their clarifier, but that's a story for another time. What this means in practical terms is that you as an operator or someone taking the certification exam really have to understand the basics of both the federal and the state legal regimes and how they work together in your particular state, because as we'll see in our talk today, it's not exactly the same everywhere. A little bit of history. These federal laws are very much the direct result of events like the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire in Cleveland and others like it. This particular fire came to light right as America was really starting to pay attention to environmental issues. It's at a time when national consciousness was being raised on a whole host of dangerous practices, not the least of which was dumping toxic chemicals and waste directly into our rivers. There had been at least 13 documented fires on the Cuyahoga in the 100 years before this one, and this event kind of became the poster child for the environmental era. It spurred an avalanche of pollution regulations like the Clean Water Act, which we'll be talking about today. Also, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement actually resulted in the creation of the EPA itself. So they like to say, every moment needs a spark, and the Cuyahoga River fire was certainly a spark that ignited Americans' desire for changes in this area. The result of the passage of the Clean Water Act, which is actually technically the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972, but it's generally referred to as the Clean Water Act, was the establishment of the EPA and a host of evolving standards and requirements that a lot of businesses, including wastewater treatment plants, work under. It's a continually evolving process, as you can see here. Starts in 1972. This list goes up to 2002, but because it's very much sort of treatment technology and water quality standards based, it's a continually evolving process. And the regulations tend to get stricter and stricter and stricter. The good news is it's actually working. The process is working. This graph shows levels of municipal sewage treatment in the United States before and after the passage of the Clean Water Act in '72. This comes from an EPA Clean Watersheds Needs Survey. And as you can see, raw discharge is basically eliminated by 1996. Less than secondary treatment has been reduced radically, and we now have greater than secondary and no discharge categories that didn't even really exist before. All of this while serving a significantly larger population. So, the process is in place for a reason, and it is doing what it's supposed to. This is the Cuyahoga River now. These improvements didn't happen overnight, but the Clean Water Act and other legislation have significantly reduced organic waste discharges into our nation's rivers, by some accounts up to about 98%. Cuyahoga River certainly hasn't caught on fire recently. It looks a lot more like this, as do the rest of our nation's waterways. It's been an across-the-board improvement. So let's, with that sort of bit of history out of the way, let's shift to the main law that we'll be talking about, which again is the Clean Water Act, or the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972. Those are what established essentially the permit program that we're talking about today. The purpose of the Clean Water Act was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. And along with that came some pretty hefty national goals, eliminating pollutants in navigable waterways by 1985, developing water quality standards by 83, eliminating the discharge of toxic pollutants in toxic amounts, providing financial assistance to publicly owned treatment works, developing and implementing adequate waste treatment management, planning and control processes in each state as well as at the federal level, researching and developing the technology to eliminate pollutant discharges, and then of course developing and implementing programs to control point and non-point sources of pollution. As it applies to wastewater discharge, the primary clean water elements are essentially the system of minimum national effluent standards that are based on available treatment technology. So, available treatment technology changes over time, so these standards change over time. A water quality standard system, which also evolves as we discover new contaminants and learn more about existing contaminants and how to get rid of them. It established the NPDES, or the permit system, a program that provides enforceable limitations on discharges and dischargers. It also has special provisions for problems like toxic chemicals in oil discharges, which typically don't necessarily apply to wastewater treatment plants. And it established a construction loan and grant program for publicly owned treatment works, which you may be familiar with through your state's Clean Water State Revolving Fund loan program. So basically, it's a big set of regulations and rules and standards that are put there to stop big things like river fires, smaller things like what's pictured here on this slide, and the other less obvious impacts of unregulated discharge. It is worth pointing out that the Clean Water Act and the NPDES regs cover a lot more than municipal wastewater treatment discharges, but for our purposes today, that's what we're going to kind of focus on. So let's talk about NPDES permit regulations. Again, this is going to be a somewhat broad overview of the permit system and regulations, which are administered by the EPA and in some cases, as we'll see, state agencies as well, working either in tandem with the EPA or having taken over the program entirely on their own. But in either case, they're focused on surface water discharges. If you really like digging up regulations, most of the Clean Water Act regs are found in 40 CFR chapters 122 and following. CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations for those of you who are unfamiliar with that. And basically what the regs say in a nutshell is that you cannot discharge pollutants from a point source into a water of the United States without an NPDES permit. So I've got a couple of highlighted terms there that I'm going to unpack. So what's a pollutant? Really broadly defined. It's any kind of industrial, municipal, and agricultural waste discharged into water. I've got municipal highlighted because that's where the wastewater treatment works tend to come in here. But as you can see, again, the Clean Water Act has a much broader application than just wastewater treatment operations. So that's the what. Let's talk a little bit about the how the discharges that are covered by this happen. So this only covers discharges from point sources, which are discernible, confined, discrete conveyances like pipes, ditches, channels, sort of a defined point that is being used for the discharge. These are some common point sources, combined sewer overflows, outflows from treatment works, storm systems. They also include things like concentrated animal feed operations, vessel discharges off the coast, non-municipal processes, and stormwater. So you can see, again, very broad application for the Act overall. Oddly enough, agricultural stormwater discharges and return flows from irrigated agriculture, for example, so like runoff into a river off of a field of fertilizer, is not a point source and isn't covered. But again, that's sort of outside the realm of what we need to know for the wastewater treatment aspects of this. And lastly, but not least, is the where. Into waters of the United States. Water of the United States is also really broadly defined in the Clean Water Act and was sort of applied ever broadenly more broadly, in the first 25 years of litigation after the Act was passed. Basically, it means navigable waters, tributaries to navigable waters, so anything you could put a boat on, interstate waters, oceans out to 200 miles, and many intrastate waters as well. It can mean just about everything, although in the last 20 years or so, this definition has been the subject of almost constant litigation, and there does seem to be a tendency toward slightly more restrictive definitions lately, and there have arguably been some inconsistent applications of this definition. But basically, it's any water that can be used or was used for commerce, tidal waters, interstate waters, including interstate wetlands, pretty much any water whose degradation could impact commerce, including tributaries and intermittent streams. So once again, very, very broad application, but what it doesn't include is groundwater. That's usually left to the states. So let's talk a little bit about the permitting process and what's typically in a permit. All of them have minimum levels of treatment based on secondary treatment processes. There might be other limitations to protect water quality as well. Permits are very site and process specific. They are not all the same, and their interplay with state requirements sometimes lead to situations where the specific permit limitations are lower than the sort of national standard that the NPDES establishes. They typically allow for self-testing. Permits also typically last 5 years. It's on the utility to actually do the renewal. There's not something, this isn't something you want to let lapse by any stretch of the imagination, because typically the EPA and your state agency are not going to chase after you to make sure you renew your permit. And there are some significant penalties that go with discharging without a permit, as we will see. Test results are typically reported on a quarterly basis on a discharge monitoring report, but there may be other reporting requirements or more strict reporting requirements depending on your particular permit. Other interesting things, permits provide for inspection of treatment works and collection of compliance verification samples. In other words, whoever's running NPDES in your state has the ability to show up, take samples, and make sure that what's coming out of your plant matches what your tests say. Permit violations can result in really significant fines, potentially criminal prosecution. Discharge permits may come from the EPA or from a state agency that's been granted authority to administer the program. Some states have this, others don't. We'll talk about that more broadly in a little bit. And last but not least, inspections can happen by the EPA, by your state agency, sometimes both, because even when the states are running the process, they have the ability to ask the EPA to come in and help. The CFR, 40 CFR 133.102 sets the minimum sort of discharge limits. As you can see here, BOD5, 30-day average can't exceed 30 milligrams per liter, 7-day average can't exceed 45 milligrams per liter, and the 30-day average percent removal has to be no less than 85%. AJ touched on this in his session on basic treatment. It's the 30-45 rule. Basically applies across the board, same rules for total suspended solids. This is a little bit easier way to look at it. There's also rules specific to fecal coliform. That is not a milligrams per liter concentration. It's an actual number of organisms per 500 milliliters. And then there's also pH requirements. And if you happen to be using chlorine for disinfection, typically it has to be non-detectable at the outflow. So these are the sort of basic minimums that a permit has or has to have. There is nothing that stops a state agency that is running the program from making their program more restrictive. And in many cases, there will be a lot of other parameters that you have to test for and report based on the particular processes and situation that your particular system is in. Total nitrates, total nitrogen, all those sorts of things might be on there. So this is just an example, a couple of screen caps from a current permit for a utility. And you can see they've got the parameters on the left, the frequency that they have to test in the center, and sample kind on the right. So some of them are 24-hour composite tests, others are instantaneous grabs. But you can see they've got a test for total ammonia, mercury, chloride, sulfates here. And then you can see their BOD5 removal and total suspended solids. The BOD5 is actually a little bit lower than the national standard, and that's just because of the laws in this particular state. I mentioned sampling. You'll be doing most of the sampling yourself, although the agency running the program may come in and check your work, so to speak. But that's how we, verify that everything is working as it should. Those analytical results will be required by your permit to be reported on a discharge monitoring report. They look something like this. There are a couple of different versions of them. I want to point out a few things. You've got parameters on the side. This number 6 here is really important. A lot of folks have a discharge permit but don't actually discharge very frequently, or perhaps even never. It's just sort of a used backup. If you've got a permit, you have to file these reports even if there's no discharges. In your permit, there will be a list of frequency codes that tell you how often things have to be tested. It's got a really basic code like this. Again, this is not something you need to memorize, but if you look at, for example, on the left-hand corner, 0107 means once every 7 days or once a week, 0121 once every 3 weeks, 02 YR twice a year. It's a relatively easy code to understand once you've sort of taken a look at it. The discharge permit will also specify reporting dates. They're not necessarily all the same. Whatever you report is going to be compared to current permit limits or enforcement orders. If you've gotten yourself in trouble, you might actually have an enforcement order out there that makes you test more frequently or restricts your ability to discharge certain kinds of things. And as I said, those DMRs are required even if you don't do a discharge. It's really important that DMRs or other reports that are similar are accurate, timely, legible, and complete, essentially because of the penalties that go along with those doing those things incorrectly. If you happen to be in EPA Region 6, there's an entire NPDES reporting requirements handbook for you. Pretty much every state that's running a program, NPDES program, has something similar that tells you the basics of how reporting works. And this is definitely something that the feds or your local state administering agency will work with you on to make sure you understand what needs to be reported and when. So for example, here in New Mexico, bypasses and overflows and upsets are subject to 24-hour reporting requirements. Oral reports have to be made within 24 hours from when you become aware of it. This could also actually be foreknowledge. So if you know something is going to happen, you have to report it with written submission to be submitted within 5 days after that. There may be other schedules and reports that you have to supply depending on the kind of process you use. Progress reports, pretreatment requirements, toxicity, sludge, stormwater. There are a lot of different kinds of NPDES permits. Which ones you have will spell out exactly what your reporting requirements are in terms of the things you have to report, how you have to test, and when those tests have to be put in. And this is also very state dependent as well. For example, Oklahoma has something called MORs, monthly operational reports that have to be submitted. In New Mexico, if you're doing land application of effluent, there's an entire reporting structure devoted specifically to that. The point I'm making here is that requirements vary, reporting requirements do. Read your permits and study state-specific guides and information for the specifics of how reporting works in your particular jurisdiction. So that's the stuff that you report when things are working well. There's also non-compliance reports. So if you have bad test results or an event happens that upsets things, essentially, if you don't comply with your permit requirements, you have to report it. Individual permits will have specific requirements for reporting anticipated non-compliance. So, if you can see something happening, it's best to notify your administering agency ahead of time so that you can deal with the problem ahead of time. Conditions that endanger health or the environment typically have a 24-hour reporting requirement. So as soon as you know that it's going to happen, you've got 24 hours to make a report. Compliance reports look something like this. This happens to be the non-compliance report form for EPA Region 6. And as you can see, got parameters, numeric values, permit limits, the date of the violation, the duration, the cause, and perhaps most importantly, the corrective action that you're going to take or other narrative that explains what happened, what you did about it, and hopefully how you're going to prevent events like that from happening again. So as I said, typically you're going to have some very specific pieces of information that you have to include in non-compliance report. You want to get that right for many reasons, one of which is the fact that all of your reported results go into a searchable EPA database called ECHO, the Enforcement and Compliance History Online. This all becomes public information. So, anybody in the public can review publicly available data about whether any permittee is in compliance with its permit. So the information included in your DMRs, including locations of discharges, what pollutants are being discharged, types and amounts of pollutants, it's all publicly available. Even if the state is administering your NPDES program and you're reporting that information to the state, it ends up in a big federal database. It looks like this. That's really easily searchable. Here's an example of what a specific utilities might look like. This happens to be a report from Albuquerque. Everything's in order here, so I don't feel bad about showing this. But you can see there's very specific information about what's allowable, what's actually been discharged. There are flags down here that will show up in these areas if things have been exceeded. So again, publicly available information, you want to make sure that you're on top of things and you can explain things. The other reason that you want to make sure that you are not fudging reports or putting in incorrect data is because of the potential penalties that go with them. A person who knowingly makes false statements, representations, or certifications that were material to any document filed or required to be maintained under the Clean Water Act is subject to penalties of up to $10,000 and 2 years in jail. This is serious. Negligent violations of the Clean Water Act can result in fines of up to 25 grand a day. And knowing violations can result in fines of up to 50 grand a day. And both of those have the potential to have jail terms coming with them. There's also provisions for administrative penalties. Permits can be modified, they can be revoked and reissued, or they can be terminated for cause. So this is not an area to be making things up or to trying to be hiding the ball. The other thing is that, those are all penalties that can be brought, by the government. Anyone adversely affected by Clean Water Act violations can actually bring lawsuits against violators of the act for administrative enforcement. So if the general public thinks the EPA or the state's not doing what it should, citizens can actually sue for injunctive relief, which are basically court orders prohibiting pollution from continuing, and along with that can go civil penalties and attorney's fees. So not trying to scare anybody, but I do want to impress upon you that the permits are there for a reason. They have to be complied with, and this is not an area to be monkeying around. So I've gone back and forth and been talking about the EPA and state regulation, which brings up the question: who actually manages NPDES in your state? Under the Clean Water Act and the regulations that administer it, the EPA has the ability to delegate NPDES authority to the states, and most but not all of them have actually taken up this role. The specific language basically says that upon approval of a state program, the EPA administrator suspends issuance of federal permits for those activities and hands that over to the state program. This is more or less the lay of the land right now. You can see it's kind of a bit of a patchwork quilt. 47 states and 1 territory are currently authorized to implement the NPDES programs in some form. Those light blue states are ones where the state's basically been fully authorized to run the program. In the yellow hashtags, they're fully authorized to administer the program, and also biosolids permitting. In the brown or red states, depending on what your monitor looks like, they're partially authorized. Typically what that means is, the EPA will still issue permits for federally owned facilities and on tribal lands. And then there's a few states like New Mexico, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, also the District of Columbia, and most of the US territories where the EPA actually administers NPDES directly. So, you end up with a little bit of a patchwork in terms of who's actually running the program. And since they sort of run in parallel to state groundwater rules and state surface water rules, it is really important to kind of figure out exactly what's going on in your state, because it's a situation where the specifics vary a little bit from state to state. So in New Mexico, for example, EPA issues all of the NPDES permits. We're in EPA Region 6, but we also have a weird situation where a significant chunk of the state of New Mexico actually belongs to the Navajo Nation, and the permits there are issued by EPA Region 9, and I believe that's because the bulk of the Navajo Nation is actually in Arizona. So there's overlapping jurisdictions and intersecting jurisdictions, and determining sort of the status quo and the particular rules that apply to you are very sort of state specific. The good thing is the EPA makes it really easy to find out who's doing what. On the same page, if you look up EPA and NPDES, you'll get to the webpage that I just showed you. Further on down is a list of every state and territory and what they are or are not authorized to permit. So Alabama, you can see they've got the state NPDES permit. They actually regulate federal facilities there as well. There's authorized to deal with state pre-treatment programs, and they do general permits, but they don't have a sludge program. Arizona does all of them. District of Columbia does none of them. Each of these blue names over here are actually links, which will send you to your specific state website. I've got a couple of examples here. We've got California on the left and Arizona on the right. And most states are pretty good at spelling out exactly what they cover and what the rules are. In California, the state water resources control boards have taken over this authority, and NPDES is implemented through the 9 state water boards, the regional water quality boards. It's worth looking into this because in some cases, there is slightly different terminology that might be in use in your jurisdiction. So for example, in California, NPDES permits are also sometimes referred to as waste discharge requirements, or WDRs, which is something you will not see from just looking at the federal regulations. So there's going to be some vocabulary differences perhaps, and again, there may be some specifics about how the rules are applied and what those rules are. And it's really important because it's explicitly stated in the CFR and in the Clean Water Act that nothing there precludes a state from adopting or enforcing requirements that are more stringent or more extensive than those that are required under that part. So that 3045 rule might actually be different in your state or for your particular utility. There's also nothing that prevents a state from operating a program with a greater scope of coverage than the NPDES. So again, more reason to sort of look into the specifics of your particular jurisdiction, even if you've got a fairly good understanding of the NPDES program as a whole. How does this work out in practical terms? Colorado, for example, the Department of Public Health and Environment administers NPDES. They also administer the state laws related to surface and groundwater discharges. For example, they enforce and permit 2 water quality laws, the Federal Clean Water Act and the Colorado Water Control Act, which applies not just to federal waters, but all state waters, even groundwater. They've got their own definitions of point sources and things like that. So in a situation like this, you've got a situation where there's a couple of different laws in place, but you've got the same agency that is handling surface water permitting and groundwater permitting. Sometimes it might be different bureaus in the same agency. But what about those places where your state doesn't have primacy or doesn't have total primacy? In other words, where the state has taken over only part of the program or none of it, like New Mexico. Well, then you get a situation like this, where essentially surface water discharge permitting is handled by the EPA and groundwater discharge permitting is handled by the state agency. New Mexico is one of those. There are a few, but I think it's worth talking about. We have essentially 2 regulatory discharge schemes in New Mexico, just like they do in Colorado. The difference being here, we've got actually 2 different agencies that are permitting them and enforcing them, but they do work together. Even though we've got 2 sets of laws and regulations enforced by 2 different agencies, and the EPA administers NPDES in New Mexico, the state still has a role in that permit application process, in that the NMED actually certifies federal permit applications to verify that they actually comply with New Mexico state law as well. So again, even in the situation in a situation where the state is running everything, they can reach out to the EPA for help. And in the state situations where the EPA is running NPDES, they often work hand in hand with the local groundwater enforcement agency to make sure that state law is being abided by as well for dischargers within that state. Here's an example of how that works in New Mexico. And again, the groundwater discharge permitting and surface water discharge permitting is often sort of two separate tracks, no matter where you are. So we have a system here in New Mexico that has a lagoon system that's permitted by NMED and a point source discharge that's currently inactive, but is permitted by the EPA. So, two streams, two permits, might also potentially have, sludge related permits and other permits related to other kinds of discharges. So in New Mexico, we've got groundwater regulations that are very clearly spelled out. They're in the New Mexico Code. If you go to the New Mexico website, it lays out, who the groundwater quality permits and under what circumstances. There is a separate permit application process that you have to go through. It's somewhat similar but different. And the reason I'm putting these up here is because even in a state where the state runs the NPDES, there are sometimes differences between surface water discharge plans and or permits and groundwater discharge permits. So, here in New Mexico, the discharge plans are administered by NMED. They apply to systems over 2,000 GPD. Oddly enough, most but not all New Mexico systems operate under discharge plans, not NPDES permits. But like the NPDES permits, they're issued for 5 years. They have monitoring requirements. And we've got this quirk where in some instances, you can have effluents that are actually over the New Mexico water quality standards, but it's very situation specific. Other things, there's specific methodologies that groundwater samples have to be analyzed under. Not all facilities can analyze their own samples. Big ones can, but sometimes small ones have to use contract labs. And then we also have monitoring reports that are filed with the NMED Groundwater Bureau quarterly. So same schedule, more or less, as the NPDES, but some slightly different requirements. So in a state like New Mexico and most other states, we've got different programs. You may only not work at a system that has an NPDES permit, but it's really good to know both sets of rules because they could come up on an exam. So, question becomes, do you know what the situation is in your state? If you don't, highly suggest you reach out and look at the resources that are available to you to find out the specifics. It's worth noting that the EPA retains oversight authority even if the permitting and enforcement authority have been authorized to the state, and there's nothing that stops the state from reaching out to EPA and asking for a helping hand when they've got a problem. The EPA typically conducts inspections where it's directly implementing NPDES, but they may also do it in states where the NPDES is being implemented by a state agency. There are a lot of other provisions in the Clean Water Act, some of which are related to wastewater utilities and some are not. You can get a full primer by going to the EPA's NPDES website. There's more information than you could possibly want to ever know on this website. There's information about the National Pretreatment Program, which is focused on indirect dischargers. Basically, this program is there to design publicly owned treatment works infrastructure and reduce conventional and toxic pollutant levels that are discharged by industries and other non-domestic wastewater sources into municipal sewer systems in the environment. So these are essentially, dischargers that are upstream from your treatment plant, whose waste you have to deal with. So it's basically trying to stop those kinds of discharges or control them. It's typically focused on industrial applications, but it could be something as simple as a car wash or grease traps in restaurants to catch fog. It could be something as complex as a chemical plant. That is a discussion way beyond the scope of our short talk today. But if your system has a pretreatment program, or you have one, or you're thinking about starting one, this is an area that we could potentially help out with in technical assistance. I think we've mentioned a few times over the course of this series, the same grant funding that provides money for these webinars also provides training and technical assistance. So you can get 20 hours of free technical assistance just by going to the EFCN website and asking for it. It's pretty obvious. It says get help. Reach out to us, tell us what the issue is. That's something that we might be able to help you with. And again, our work is free. It's subsidized fully by the EPA. So it's your tax dollars at work. There's also things like related to sludge disposal and 40 CFR 503, which talks about different kinds of sludge use, beneficial use for land application in bulk or service disposal. Here in New Mexico, landfill disposal is actually covered under state rules, not federal, but basic goal of these is to set requirements for pathogen reduction, vector attraction reduction, heavy metal, and I should actually say PCB pollutants, land disposal restrictions, management practices, and determining how you store things. So again, it is a very, very broad set of rules and applications. You don't have to know gritty details typically particularly for a level 1 exam, but you do have to know the basics, what the NPDES system is, what it covers, what its authority stems from, and again, how it interacts with your state law. So covered a lot of material here, but since this whole series is all about getting you ready for a certification test, let's do a couple of questions that are related to things that I covered in our session today. Kristen, if you wouldn't mind firing up our first poll question, are you able to do that from your end?
Absolutely. I am launching the first question right now.
Awesome.
How soon after an overflow that will endanger health does the event have to be orally reported? And you'll choose between 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, or 48 hours. All right, and go ahead and get your answers in. I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. Looks like 85% chose 24 hours.
Yeah, basically everybody got it right because there's no penalty for reporting early, but there might be penalties for reporting it late. So yeah, typically it's 24 hours. Obviously reporting sooner than that is not a problem. And there may actually be some variations with this because again, there's nothing in the Clean Water Act or the accompanying regulations that prohibit a state from having stricter requirements than the Clean Water Act itself does. Why don't we move on to our next question?
How soon after an overflow that will endanger health does the event have to be reported in writing? 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, or 10 days? And get those answers in. I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, 1.
All right, good again. Typically it's 5 days, maybe shorter in your jurisdiction. There may be some situations, because again, there are a lot of variations where it is longer than that, but typically it's 5 days or less. Why don't we pull up our third question here and then we'll talk about some available resources and give our folks the rest of the day back.
Which federal law established the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System? the 1974 Safe Drinking Water Act, the 1972 Clean Water Act, the 1969 National Environmental Policy Act, or the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act. Get those answers in. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll in 3, 2, 1.
All right, most of us got that right as well. It is the 72 Clean Water Act. All of those other ones are actually real acts that in some way impact water, but the NPDES system basically came under the 72 Act. Safe Drinking Water Act is related to drinking water. That's essentially the drinking water analog to the Clean Water Act, which is dealing with discharges. So good, everybody. I want to just take a quick minute to plug some available resources for you, both in terms of testing and just getting general information about wastewater treatment. You've got the EFCN website. You also have our particular EFC's website, which is swefc.unm.edu. Up here we have switchboards, although I think this may have been changed to info hubs. There's a lot of sort of secondary websites that are packed full of resources available for you. There is a wastewater and decentralized systems info hub that has all sorts of information related to conventional treatment and decentralized treatment. I want to point out a couple of resources on there and specific. There are links directly to the NPDES application forms and permit basics. So if you want to bone up on the permit basics at the federal level, you can look there. Of course, you can also just Google this and get straight there. There are also a couple of resources related specifically to licensing. One that lays out licensing requirements across the United States. So if you're not sure what's going on in your state, or if your state doesn't have any particularly good resources available, this might be something to check to see what is required. The other is this WPI operator certification sample exam questions. These are definitely worth looking at, particularly if your state happens to be one of those jurisdictions that uses the WPI exams. But even if they have their own state testing centers, many, if not most states, are moving to computerized tests right now. If you've never taken a computerized test, it can be kind of intimidating. They have sample exam questions that you can access for free through the WPI website to give you a feel for the interface. And then we've got a lot of other things like switchboards for state revolving funds and asset management and things like that. With that, I am going to open the floor for questions. Again, I apologize, we ran a little bit late getting started because we had some technical difficulties, but the floor is certainly open for questions if anyone has any. And in the meantime, I will throw our contact information up. You've got mine, you've got AJ's, and you haven't met Rose yet, but in upcoming sessions, Rose will be handling wastewater treatment math topics, which are always a good thing to learn about. So with that, the floor is open and we'll hang out and answer any questions that we can do, and any questions that we can't answer, we will get back to you on. And again, if you're interested in receiving some free technical assistance, you can reach out through the link that got thrown into the chat, or you could contact us directly via email. So with that, floor is open. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't have any questions, and for anyone who does, we're happy to hang out and have a little chat here.
And I'm not seeing any questions at this point, James. But
Okay.
Yeah, we can still hang out for a little while.
Yeah, we'll hang out and let people drop off in case anybody comes up with anything. Again, you can always reach out to us afterwards about this topic or any other topic related to wastewater treatment. Again, free technical assistance is available. We're your tax dollars at work, and you asking us questions gives us things to do. So thanks again for joining us. Hope to see you again at the next session and sessions after that.
Thank you, James, for your expertise. We appreciate you. Also, thanks to everyone for your patience today. Following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following the webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics important to you. Thank you again. We hope to see you at future EFCN events.